$12, 3 children, and a winter that didn't care about prayers. Ruth Hawkins had no husband to protect her name, and no town willing to protect her life. The firewood wouldn't last until March, the food wouldn't last until Christmas. And in Crookston, the men who offered help smiled the way wolves do, polite, patient, certain, because hunger doesn't just kill bodies, it makes people desperate enough to trade away whatever they swore was never for sale. And Ruth was about to find out what winter really collects when money runs out. Before we go any further, tell me something. Where are you watching this from? City and country? I read every comment. Ruth had not always been alone. There was a time, not so long ago, when she believed that marriage meant safety, that a man's name could shield you from the worst the world had to offer. She had married young, 17, to a man named Thomas Hawkins, who worked the lumber camps up north and came home smelling of pine resin and sweat and whiskey. He pretended he had not been drinking. He was not cruel. He was not kind either. He was simply there, a presence that filled the cabin with noise and need, and then emptied it again when the season called him back to the trees. For 8 years, she had lived in that rhythm, waiting and working, raising children in the gaps between his arrivals and departures. The first child came 10 months after the wedding, the second 18 months later, the third, a boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn mouth, arrived on a February night so cold the water in the basin froze before she could wash him. Thomas had left in late September of 1888, as he always did, heading north to the camps near Bemidji, where the timber companies paid men $4 a week to cut until their hands bled and their backs bent like old iron. He kissed the children without looking at them. He nodded at Ruth. He said he would be back by Christmas with enough money to see them through until spring planting. She watched him walk down the frozen path toward the road, his boots crunching through the first thin layer of snow, his shoulders hunched against the wind, and she felt nothing. Not fear, not hope, not even anger anymore. Just the quiet gray knowledge that this was how it would always be. Waiting, working, surviving in the spaces he left behind. The letter arrived on November 14th. She remembered the date because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays were the day she baked bread if there was flour, and there had been just enough that week for one small loaf. The man who brought the letter was a logger from the same camp, a Swede with a wind-burned face and eyes that would not meet hers. His name was Nielsen. He stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands and told her in broken English that Thomas had been killed 3 days prior. A white pine had fallen wrong, he said, 60 feet tall, thick as a wagon wheel at the base. It had pinned Thomas beneath the trunk before the Sawyers could shout a warning. He had died quickly, Nielsen said, though Ruth suspected that was a lie men told widows to make death sound cleaner than it was. The lumber company had sent compensation, $20. Nielsen counted it onto her kitchen table in small bills, his thick fingers clumsy with the paper, and then he left without offering condolences or waiting for her to speak. Ruth stood there with her hands still dusted with flour, staring at the money. $20, 8 years of marriage, 3 children. A husband she had stopped loving somewhere around the birth of the second child, when she realized that loneliness was not cured by a man who was only present in body and absent in every other way that mattered. And $20. She did not cry. She had expected to cry, had braced herself for the weight of grief, but it did not come. What came instead was a strange, cold clarity, a sense of the ground shifting beneath her, not violently, but slowly, like ice cracking on a river you had thought was solid. She was alone now, truly alone, and the winter was coming. She buried $10 in a tin can beneath the floorboards near the stove, a place she could reach quickly if she needed to. She used $8 to buy flour, lard, salt, dried beans, and a small sack of oats from the general store in Crookston. She kept $2 in her pocket, folded tight and sewn into the lining of her coat, because she had learned long ago that a woman needed money no one else knew about. Money that could not be taken, money that could not be borrowed or stolen or bargained away. The funeral was held 4 days later. The preacher, Reverend Moss, spoke for 11 minutes about a man he had never met, using words like duty and labor and providence, words that sounded holy but meant nothing. The neighbors came because it was expected, not because they cared. They stood in the cold outside the small church and looked at Ruth with eyes that measured and judged and found her wanting. She was foreign-born, Norwegian, and though she had lived in Polk County for 8 years, she was still considered an outsider. Her English was good, but it carried an accent that marked her as other. Her children were too loud, too wild, not properly disciplined, and now she was a widow with no family, no man, no means of support. She was, in the eyes of the community, a problem. They brought nothing to the funeral. No food, no firewood, no offers of help. They shook her hand with cold fingers and murmured phrases that evaporated in the freezing air. And then they left, all of them, even the preacher, even the women from the church who organized charity drives for families in need. They looked at Ruth and her 3 children standing alone by the grave, and they turned away. She understood what that meant. She was not their responsibility. She was not their concern. If she survived the winter, it would be on her own. By late November, the cold had begun to settle in earnest. The sky turned the color of old pewter, low and heavy, pressing down on the flat prairie like a lid on a pot. The wind came from the north, steady and merciless, carrying the smell of snow and distance. Ruth woke each morning to frost on the inside of the cabin windows, delicate patterns of ice that looked almost beautiful until you remembered they meant the walls were too thin, the gaps too wide, the cold seeping in through every crack. She stuffed rags into the spaces between the logs. She hung a quilt over the door. She moved the children's bed closer to the stove, so close that the youngest, James, could reach out and touch the warm iron if he woke in the night. The cabin was small, rough-built, the kind of structure a man threw together when he planned to improve it later and then never did. 1 room, dirt floor, a stove in the center, a table, 2 chairs, a bed for the children, a narrow cot for Ruth, shelves made from scrap lumber, a trunk that held their clothes, what little they had. It was not much, but it was all they had, and it would have to be enough. She counted the firewood every morning. Thomas had cut and stacked 2 cords in September before he left. It had seemed like a lot at the time, but now, looking at the pile shrinking day by day, Ruth realized it would not last. Not through a Minnesota winter, not through 4 months of cold that could drop to 20 below zero, 30 below on the worst nights, cold that killed livestock and froze wells solid and turned human skin black with frostbite in minutes. She burned the wood carefully, splitting each log into smaller pieces, feeding the stove just enough to keep the cabin above freezing during the day and letting the fire die to coals at night. But even with rationing, the math did not work. She had firewood for maybe 2 months, 3 if she burned almost nothing, and winter would last until April. The food was worse. She had flour for 6 weeks, maybe 8 if she stretched it thin, beans for a month, lard for 3 weeks. The oats would be gone by Christmas. She had no meat except for a small piece of salt pork, hard and gray, that she cut into slivers so thin you could see through them. She had no milk, no butter, no eggs, no garden left. The frost had killed everything in October. No chickens. Thomas had sold them before he left, said they ate too much feed, and did not lay enough to justify keeping. She had argued with him about that, one of the few times she had bothered to argue. But he had done it anyway. She made a list in her head of what they would need to survive. More firewood, more food, warmer clothes for the children whose coats were too small and whose shoes had holes in the soles, medicine in case someone got sick, lamp oil, because the nights were already 16 hours long and getting longer. She added up the cost in her mind and compared it to the $12 she had left. The numbers did not add up. They did not even come close. She would need credit. She would need help. She would need charity. And she knew, with a certainty that sat heavy in her chest, that none of those things would come easily. The town of Crookston sat 2 miles to the east, a small collection of wooden buildings arranged along a single street that turned to frozen mud in winter. It had a general store, a church, a school, a land office, a blacksmith, and 2 saloons where men gathered to drink and gamble and complain about weather and prices and the government. Ruth had been to Crookston only a handful of times since Thomas died. Each visit felt like walking through a town that had already decided she did not belong. The shopkeeper watched her too closely. The women at the church smiled with their mouths, but not their eyes. The men stared in a way that made her skin crawl, not with desire exactly, but with a kind of cold assessment, as if they were calculating her value and finding it low. She did not want to go back. But she had no choice. One afternoon in early December, with the sky threatening snow and the wind sharp enough to cut, Ruth bundled the children in every piece of clothing they owned and walked to town. Mary, 6 years old, walked beside her without complaint, her small hand gripping Ruth's tightly. Samuel, 4, dragged behind, whining about the cold. James, not yet 2, rode on Ruth's hip, his face pressed against her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck. The walk took nearly an hour. By the time they reached the edge of town, Ruth's feet were numb and her lungs burned from breathing cold air. She went to the church first. Not to pray. She had stopped praying weeks ago after the funeral, after she realized that God either did not hear her or did not care. She went because the preacher's wife, Mrs. Colby, ran a charity fund for families in need, and Ruth had decided after days of internal argument that she qualified as a family in need. Mrs. Colby met her in the church vestibule, a small room that smelled of old wood and lamp oil. She was a thin woman with gray hair pulled tight into a bun, and a face that looked like it had been carved from something hard and unforgiving. She listened to Ruth's request with her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral, her eyes cold. When Ruth finished speaking, Mrs. Colby sighed softly, the kind of sigh that carried judgment wrapped in pity. "We help families, Mrs. Hawkins," she said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "But we have to be careful. The fund is limited, and there are considerations." She paused, choosing her words with care. "Your husband, God rest him, was not a member of this congregation. You yourself attend only irregularly. And frankly, Mrs. Hawkins, there are families in this community who have been here longer, who have contributed more, who—" She trailed off, letting the silence finish the sentence. Ruth understood. She was not the right kind of poor, not the right kind of widow, not Norwegian enough to be helped by the Norwegian families, not American enough to be helped by the rest. She was in between, invisible, unwanted. She stood up without another word and walked out. The children followed, silent now, sensing her anger even if they did not understand it. Outside, the snow had begun to fall, small, hard flakes that stung when they hit her face. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter and started walking home. She did not look back. She did not cry. She simply walked, her children trailing behind her like shadows, the town of Crookston disappearing into the gray distance behind them. That night, after the children were asleep, Ruth sat by the stove and stared into the fire. The flames were small, barely enough to warm her hands. The cabin was dark except for that small circle of light. Outside, the wind rattled the walls, and the snow fell harder, piling against the door, sealing them in. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the life she had imagined when she married him, the life that had never materialized. She thought about the neighbors who had come to the funeral and left without helping. She thought about Mrs. Colby and her careful, polite cruelty. She thought about the winter stretching ahead, long and cold and merciless, and she realized something that settled in her chest like a weight she would carry for the rest of her life. No one was coming to save her. No one had ever been coming. If her children were going to survive this winter, it would not be because the world was kind. It would not be because people took pity on her. It would be because she refused to let them die. It would be because she was willing to do whatever it took, no matter how hard, no matter how humiliating, no matter how much it cost. She fed another stick of wood into the stove and watched it catch fire. The light flared briefly, then settled into a steady glow. It was a small fire, but it was hers, and she would keep it burning no matter what. The cold did not arrive all at once. It came in stages, like a predator testing its prey, each wave colder than the last, each morning harder than the one before. By mid-December, the temperature had dropped so low that the air itself seemed to crack and splinter when Ruth stepped outside. The snow no longer fell soft and gentle. It came in hard, wind-driven bursts that scoured the prairie and piled in drifts against the cabin walls, drifts that grew taller each day until they reached the bottom of the window frames. She had to shovel a path to the woodpile every morning, her arms burning with effort, her breath coming in ragged clouds that froze in the air before they could dissipate. The firewood pile shrank faster than she had calculated. She had been careful, burning only what was necessary, letting the fire die down to coals at night, waking in the dark to a cabin so cold she could see frost forming on the inside walls. But careful was not enough. The wood was disappearing. By Christmas, it was half gone. By early January, she could see the ground beneath the bottom logs. She started breaking each piece into smaller fragments, splitting them again and again until they were barely thicker than kindling, feeding them to the stove one at a time, trying to stretch each log as far as it would go. But mathematics did not care about effort. The wood would run out. It was only a question of when. The children felt the cold before she did. Their bodies were smaller, thinner, less able to hold warmth against the relentless press of winter. Mary, the oldest, woke most mornings shivering so hard her teeth chattered, her lips faintly blue, her fingers stiff and slow. She never complained. She was 6 years old and already learning that complaints changed nothing. Samuel, 4, had stopped asking why it was so cold, why there was no fire at night, why his toes hurt when he walked. He simply curled tighter under the blankets, his small body pulled into itself like something trying to disappear. And James, the baby, cried less now. He had been a fussy child, loud and demanding, but the cold had stolen his voice. He whimpered sometimes in the night, a thin sound that cut through Ruth like a blade, but he no longer cried the way babies were supposed to cry, and that terrified her more than anything else. She moved their bed closer to the stove, so close that she worried they might burn themselves if they reached out in the night. She piled every blanket they owned onto that bed, plus her own coat, plus Thomas's old wool jacket that still smelled faintly of tobacco and pine. She slept on the floor beside them, curled on a thin pad of straw with a single threadbare quilt pulled over her shoulders. The dirt floor was frozen hard as stone. The cold seeped up through the straw and into her bones, settling deep in her hips and spine, an ache that never fully left. But the children were warmer, and that was all that mattered. By mid-January, the food had become a problem she could no longer ignore. She had been rationing carefully since November, measuring out flour by the spoonful, soaking beans overnight to make them swell and seem like more than they were, cutting the salt pork into slivers so thin you could almost see through them. Breakfast was a thin porridge made with water and a handful of oats, cooked until it was barely more than gray paste. Dinner was beans boiled soft, sometimes with a fragment of pork fat for flavor, sometimes without. There was no lunch. There had not been lunch since December. The children were always hungry. They did not say it directly, not anymore, but she could see it in their faces, in the way they scraped their bowls with their fingers, licking up every last trace of food, in the way their eyes followed her hands when she measured out the next meal. Mary had started asking if there would be more tomorrow. Ruth always said yes. It was a lie. But it was a lie that let them sleep. She ate last and least, scraping the pot for whatever remained after the children had been fed. Most nights that meant a few spoonfuls of watery broth and nothing else. Her body had begun to change. Her dresses, already worn and patched, hung loose on her frame. Her ribs pressed against her skin like something trying to escape. Her face had thinned, the bones of her cheeks and jaw standing out sharp and prominent. When she caught her reflection in the window glass at night, she barely recognized herself. But recognition did not matter. Survival mattered, and survival meant the children ate first. She had tried to supplement their food with whatever she could find. She melted snow for water, boiling it before they drank because she had heard that unboiled snow could make you sick. She scavenged the edges of the property for anything edible, digging through frozen dirt for old potatoes the harvest had missed, finding only two, both half-rotten and soft. She boiled them anyway, mashed them into the porridge, told the children it made the meal richer. They believed her because they wanted to. She set snares for rabbits, using wire Thomas had left in the shed and instructions she half-remembered from watching her father as a child in Norway. The snares caught nothing. Either she was placing them wrong or there were no rabbits left, driven away by the cold, or already caught by someone else. She tried ice fishing on the frozen creek a quarter-mile from the cabin, cutting a hole with the axe and dropping a line baited with a scrap of pork fat. She sat for 3 hours in wind that felt like it would strip the skin from her face, and caught nothing. The creek was empty or frozen too deep, or she simply did not know what she was doing. Every attempt to find more food ended the same way. In failure. In cold. In the growing realization that she was running out of options. By late January, the firewood was nearly gone. She counted it one morning and felt her stomach drop. 8 logs left, maybe 10 if she counted the half-rotten pieces she had been avoiding because they smoked too much and gave almost no heat. 10 logs. In a winter that could last another 10 weeks. She started burning the furniture. Not all of it. Not yet. Just the pieces they did not absolutely need. The second chair, the one with the broken leg that wobbled when you sat on it. The small side table Thomas had built but never finished, its surface rough and uneven. She broke them apart with the axe, smashing them into pieces small enough to fit in the stove, and fed them to the fire. The wood burned fast, too fast, but it burned hot, and for a few hours the cabin felt almost warm. The children stopped shivering. Their faces regained a little color. Ruth allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that they would make it. But belief was a luxury she could not afford for long. The wood from the furniture lasted 3 days. Then it was gone, and she was back to counting logs, back to rationing heat, back to waking in the night with her breath freezing in the air above her face. She thought about going back to town, asking for help again, trying the general store or the land office or even knocking on doors and begging directly. But the memory of Mrs. Colby's cold refusal still burned in her chest, and she knew, with a certainty that felt like something breaking inside her, that going back would only bring more humiliation, more judgment, more polite refusals wrapped in Christian pity. She was alone, truly, completely alone. And the winter was not even half over. One morning in early February, she woke to find Samuel burning with fever. His forehead was hot to the touch, his skin dry and papery. He coughed in short, sharp bursts that shook his whole body, a wet rattling sound that came from deep in his chest. She held him upright, rubbing his back, trying to help him breathe while Mary and James watched with wide, frightened eyes. She had no medicine, no money for a doctor, no way to help him except to keep him warm and hope his body could fight whatever sickness had taken hold. She boiled water and made him drink it, cup after cup, even though he whined and pushed her hands away. She wrapped him in every blanket she could spare, piling them on top of him until only his face showed, pale and damp with sweat despite the cold. She stayed awake all night, sitting beside him, listening to his breathing, praying to a God she was no longer sure existed that her son would not die. By morning the fever had not broken, but it had not gotten worse either. Samuel slept fitfully, his small chest rising and falling in uneven rhythms. Ruth sat beside him, her hand on his forehead, and felt the weight of her helplessness settle over her like a shroud. She needed medicine. She needed a doctor. She needed money. She had none of those things. That afternoon, while Samuel slept and the other children huddled near the stove, Ruth went outside and stood in the cold, staring at the empty woodpile. The wind bit at her face and hands. The sky was the color of dirty ice, low and threatening. Snow was coming. She could smell it in the air. She thought about her options. She could burn more furniture, the table, the bed frame, the shelves. She could tear apart the cabin itself if she had to, pull boards from the walls and feed them to the fire. But that would only buy time, a week, maybe 2, and then what? She could try hunting again, setting more snares, walking farther from the cabin in search of game. But she had already tried that, and failed. Or she could go to town. She could swallow her pride, her anger, her fear. She could go to the general store and ask the shopkeeper, Mr. Brennan, for credit, for help, for mercy. She knew what that would cost. She had seen it in his eyes the last time she was there. The way he looked at her, the way his smile lingered too long, the way his words carried implications he never spoke aloud. Men like Brennan did not give help for free. They expected payment, and the payment they wanted from women like Ruth was not the kind that could be settled with money. But Samuel was sick. The firewood was gone. The food was running out, and the winter was not even close to finished. She stood there in the cold, her breath clouding the air, her hands clenched into fists inside her coat pockets, and felt something harden inside her chest. Not resolve exactly. Something colder than that. Something meaner. The knowledge that she was being pushed toward a choice she did not want to make. A choice between her dignity and her children's lives. And that the world expected her to choose survival no matter what it cost. But there were costs she would not pay. Not yet. Not unless there was no other way. She turned and went back inside. She fed the last of the firewood to the stove, just enough to keep it burning through the night. She boiled more water for Samuel and made him drink it. She sat with the children and told them a story, a long rambling tale about summer and gardens and warm days that felt like something from another life, something that might have been real once, but now felt like a dream. And when the children finally fell asleep, all three of them curled together under the pile of blankets, Ruth sat alone in the dark and made herself a promise. She would go to town tomorrow. She would ask for help one more time. But she would not beg, and she would not sell herself. There had to be another way. There had to be. She just had to find it before the cold found them first. The walk to town the next morning felt longer than it had ever been. Ruth left the children alone in the cabin, something she hated doing but had no choice about. Mary was old enough to watch the younger ones for a few hours, old enough to keep the stove fed with the last scraps of wood, old enough to understand that she must not open the door for anyone. Ruth kissed her forehead and told her to be brave, and Mary nodded with eyes that looked far older than 6 years should allow. The sky was white and featureless, the kind of sky that meant more snow was coming soon. The wind had died down to almost nothing, which made the cold feel even more oppressive, as if the air itself had frozen solid and she was walking through something thick and resistant. Her feet crunched through the hard-packed snow on the road, each step sending sharp pains up through her legs. She had wrapped her shoes in strips of burlap because the soles had worn through completely, but the cloth was already soaked and freezing, and she could feel the cold seeping into her toes, turning them numb and clumsy. By the time she reached Crookston, her feet had stopped hurting, which she knew was a bad sign. Frostbite started with numbness. She had seen it before, seen men lose toes and fingers to the cold, seen the blackened flesh that came after. But she could not think about that now. She had come to town for a reason, and she would finish what she started. The general store sat on the main street, a 2-story building with a false front that made it look bigger than it was. A painted sign above the door read, "Brennan and Sons, General Merchandise," in faded letters. There were no sons. There had never been sons. Mr. Brennan was a widower who had moved to Polk County 15 years earlier, with money from somewhere back east and a talent for business that had made him one of the wealthier men in town. He owned the store, owned the building next to it, owned shares in the grain elevator and the lumber mill. He was 47 years old, soft around the middle. With thinning hair he combed carefully over his scalp and hands that were always clean, always soft, the hands of a man who had never done hard labor in his life. Ruth had been in his store perhaps a dozen times over the years. She had never liked him. There was something in the way he looked at women, a slow, deliberate gaze that lingered too long, that made assessments and calculations that had nothing to do with commerce. But he was the only merchant in town who extended credit, and credit was what she needed. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The warmth hit her immediately, a wall of heat from the large cast-iron stove in the center of the room. It was almost painful after the bitter cold outside, like her skin was waking up all at once. The store smelled of wood smoke and coffee and the sharp tang of pickled goods. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned foods, bolts of fabric, tools, lamp oil, tobacco, flour in cloth sacks, sugar in barrels. It was a smell of abundance, of plenty, and it made Ruth's stomach twist with hunger and something closer to anger. Mr. Brennan stood behind the counter at the back of the store, writing in a ledger with careful, precise strokes. He looked up when the door closed, and his face arranged itself into an expression that might have been welcome if it had reached his eyes. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said, setting down his pen, "I didn't expect to see you today. Cold out there, isn't it?" She did not answer the pleasantry. She walked to the counter and stood there, her hands folded in front of her, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need to ask for credit, Mr. Brennan, for supplies. I can pay you back in the spring when I can work." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes moving over her face, her threadbare coat, the burlap wrapped around her shoes. "Credit," he said slowly, as if tasting the word. "That's a serious thing, Mrs. Hawkins, especially in winter, especially for someone in your situation." There was that word again. Situation. As if widowhood were something shameful, something she had chosen. "I understand," she said quietly, "but my son is sick. I need medicine, and I need firewood and flour and—" "I know what you need," he interrupted gently. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the counter. "The question is what you can offer in return. Credit isn't charity, Mrs. Hawkins. It's a loan, and loans require collateral or trust or—" He paused, letting the silence stretch. Some other form of assurance. She felt her chest tighten. She knew where this was going. She had known before she walked through the door. But hearing it, standing here in the warmth of his store while her children sat cold and hungry 2 miles away, made it real in a way that anticipation had not. "I'll work," she said. "I can clean or mend or—" "I don't need cleaning," he said. His voice was still gentle, still reasonable. "And I don't need mending. What I need, Mrs. Hawkins, is to know that my generosity will be appreciated." The word hung in the air between them like something solid and ugly. Appreciated. She understood exactly what he meant. She had heard this language before, the careful euphemisms men used when they wanted something they knew they should not ask for directly. Appreciated. Arrangement. Understanding. Words that meant a woman's body in exchange for survival. She looked at him, at his soft hands and his carefully combed hair, and his eyes that held no warmth at all despite the smile on his face. And she felt something cold and hard settle in her chest, something that pushed back against the fear and desperation that had driven her here. "No," she said. The word came out quiet but firm, a door closing. His smile did not waver, but something changed in his eyes, a flicker of annoyance quickly suppressed. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said, his tone still patient, still kind, "I don't think you understand the position you're in. Winter isn't half over. You have 3 children to feed, no income, no husband, no family." He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "I'm offering to help you. All I'm asking is that you be practical about it." "Practical," she repeated. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. "Yes." He leaned closer, lowering his voice as if they were sharing a confidence. "No one needs to know, Mrs. Hawkins. It would be between us, a private arrangement. You'd have everything you need. Medicine for your boy, firewood, food. And in return—" He let the sentence trail off, his meaning clear. She thought about Samuel, burning with fever in the cabin. She thought about the empty woodpile and the dwindling food, and the way James had stopped crying because he was too cold and too hungry to waste energy on tears. She thought about how easy it would be to say yes, to close her eyes and let this man take what he wanted, to trade pieces of herself for her children's survival. And then she thought about what that would cost, not just her body, but something deeper, something that once sold could never be bought back, her dignity, her sense of self. The ability to look her children in the eye and tell them that some things were not for sale. "No," she said again, louder this time. She took a step back from the counter. "I won't." The smile disappeared from his face, not all at once but slowly, like ice melting. What replaced it was something colder, harder. "Then I can't help you," he said flatly. "Credit requires trust, Mrs. Hawkins. And frankly, I don't see any reason to trust a woman who refuses a perfectly reasonable business arrangement." "Business arrangement," she repeated, and now there was anger in her voice, sharp and bright. "That's what you're calling it?" He straightened, his expression settling into something that looked almost offended. "I'm calling it practical. You're calling it whatever your pride tells you to call it. But pride doesn't keep children warm, Mrs. Hawkins. Pride doesn't fill empty stomachs. You can walk out of here with nothing, or you can be sensible about this. Your choice." She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who held all the power in this room, who knew she was desperate and was using that desperation like a weapon. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like something breaking, that this was not really about her at all. This was about what men like Brennan had always done to women like her. Women without money, women without protection, women who had no choice but to ask for help and then discovered that help always came with conditions. But she did have a choice. It might be a hard choice, a choice that led to suffering and hunger and cold. But it was still a choice. "Keep your credit," she said quietly. She turned and walked toward the door. "You'll be back," he called after her. "When the food runs out, when the cold gets worse, when your boy's fever doesn't break, you'll come back, Mrs. Hawkins. And the terms won't be as generous." She did not answer. She pushed open the door and stepped out into the cold, and the shock of it after the warmth of the store was like being slapped. The wind had picked up again, driving tiny particles of ice against her face. She pulled her shawl tighter and started walking. Her feet ached, her legs trembled with exhaustion and cold. Her stomach was empty and her head felt light, disconnected, as if she were watching herself from a distance. But she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, away from the store, away from Brennan and his soft hands and his reasonable voice and his ugly proposition. She did not cry. There was no point in crying. Crying would not change what had just happened. It would not make the walk home shorter or the cabin warmer or the children less hungry. But as she walked, as the town disappeared behind her and the empty prairie opened up ahead, she felt something shift inside her. Not defeat, something else, something harder and sharper and more dangerous than defeat, a kind of fury. Not loud or hot, but cold and deep. The kind of fury that did not explode, but instead compressed itself into something dense and unbreakable. Men like Brennan thought they could break her, thought that desperation would make her willing to accept anything, to become anything, to sell anything. They thought that being poor meant being powerless, that being a woman meant being available. They were wrong. She would not break, she would not bend. She would not let them turn her into what they expected her to be. She would survive this winter on her own terms. She would find another way. She had to. Because the alternative, the version of herself that said yes to men like Brennan, that traded dignity for survival, that taught her children that some people were meant to be used, was not a version she could live with. The cabin appeared in the distance, a small dark shape against the white expanse of snow. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line. Mary had kept the fire going. Good girl. Ruth quickened her pace, her frozen feet stumbling through the drifts, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She did not know how she would keep them alive. She did not know where the next meal would come from, or the next armload of firewood or the medicine Samuel needed. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had walked into Brennan's store as a woman who still had choices, and she had walked out the same way. That counted for something. That had to count for something, even if it was the only thing she had left. Ruth reached the cabin as the first snow began to fall. Not the light, drifting snow of early winter, but heavy, wet flakes that came down thick and fast, the kind that buried everything if it lasted long enough. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, stamping her feet to shake off the snow, unwrapping the frozen burlap from her shoes with fingers so numb she could barely feel them. Mary looked up from where she sat beside Samuel's bed, her face pale and anxious. "Mama," she said quietly, "did you get medicine?" Ruth shook her head. She did not trust herself to speak yet. She crossed to the stove and held her hands over it, feeling the painful tingle as warmth began to return to her fingers. Samuel was still asleep, his breathing rough and uneven. James sat in the corner with a piece of wood, turning it over and over in his small hands, too cold or too tired to play properly. "There's no more wood, Mama," Mary said. "I used the last piece." Ruth nodded. She had known it was coming, had counted the logs and done the mathematics in her head a dozen times, but knowing something and facing it were different things. "It's all right," she said, though it was not all right, would never be all right. "We'll manage." She did not know how, but she said it anyway, because that was what mothers did. They lied to make their children feel safe, even when safety was an illusion, even when the walls were closing in and the cold was seeping through every crack and there was nothing left to burn. That night, after the children had eaten the last of the beans, thin and watery, and barely enough to quiet their hunger, Ruth sat at the table and took inventory of everything they had left. The flour was gone. The beans were gone. The oats were gone. The salt pork was gone. All that remained was a small amount of lard, maybe 2 spoonfuls and a half cup of salt. That was all. In the middle of February, with 2 months of winter still ahead, that was everything they had to eat. She could not go back to Brennan. That door had closed. She could not go to the church. Mrs. Colby had made it clear that charity had limits, and Ruth had already exceeded them. She could not ask the neighbors because the neighbors had shown by their absence at Thomas's funeral that they considered her problems hers alone. She was trapped, caught between starvation and surrender, between watching her children die slowly or selling herself to keep them alive. It was the choice men like Brennan counted on, the choice designed to break women like her. But there were other kinds of work, harder work, work that would not pay much but would pay something, work that men did not want and women were not supposed to do, work that would bleed her hands and break her back, but leave her dignity intact. The next morning, despite the snow that had fallen overnight, despite the cold that made every breath feel like swallowing glass, Ruth left the children again and walked not to town but in the opposite direction, toward the farms that sprawled across the county in every direction. She walked for 3 hours, stopping at every homestead she passed, knocking on doors asking if there was work. Any work, washing, mending, cleaning stables, hauling water, splitting wood, anything. Most doors opened only a crack. Most voices said no before she finished speaking. But one farmer, an old Swede named Eriksson who had lost his wife the previous spring and lived alone with 2 grown sons, looked at her for a long moment and then nodded. "I got washing," he said in heavily accented English. "Clothes, blankets, you wash, I pay, 2 bits for the lot. 25 cents. It was nothing. It was barely enough to buy a pound of flour, but it was something." "I'll take it," she said. He brought out a basket piled high with clothes that smelled of sweat and smoke, and worse things she did not want to think about. She carried it home on her hip, the weight of it pulling at her shoulder, the wet fabric soaking through her coat. At the cabin, she heated water over the stove, melting snow because there was no other source, and scrubbed the clothes against a washboard until her knuckles bled. The lye soap burned her cracked skin. The cold water made her hands ache. But she worked through it piece by piece, wringing out each garment and hanging it over a rope she strung across the cabin to dry. It took all day. By the time she finished, her hands were raw and her back screamed with pain. But the clothes were clean. And the next morning she carried them back to Eriksson's farm and collected her 25 cents. She used it to buy flour, 1 pound. The shopkeeper at the grain mill, a different man than Brennan, older and less interested in her situation, weighed it out and took her coins without comment. She walked home with the small cloth sack pressed against her chest like something precious. That night the children ate bread. Not much. just a small piece each. But it was warm and soft, and it filled their mouths with something other than hunger. Samuel's fever broke the next day, not because of medicine, but because his body had fought through it on its own. He was weak and thin and pale as paper, but he was alive. Ruth sat beside his bed and watched him sleep and felt something loosen in her chest, some terrible knot of fear that had been wound tight for days. But the relief did not last long, because the flour was already half gone, and there was still no firewood, and the cold was getting worse. She went back to the farms. She found more washing. She found mending work, sewing buttons and patching holes in work shirts for 10 cents a basket. She found a widow who needed help butchering a pig and paid her in meat, 3 pounds of fatty pork that Ruth wrapped in cloth and rationed out over a week. She worked every day, walking miles through snow and cold, carrying heavy loads, scrubbing and sewing and hauling until her body felt like it would collapse. And every night she came home to the cabin and counted the coins she had earned and knew it was not enough. It would never be enough. But she kept working anyway, because working meant she did not have to think. It meant she could come home exhausted and fall asleep immediately, without lying awake in the dark, calculating how many days until spring, how many meals she could stretch from what little food remained, how long before the cold won. The furniture was almost gone. She had burned the table, breaking it apart with an axe and feeding it piece by piece to the stove. She had burned the shelves. She had burned the bed frame, and now the children's mattress lay directly on the floor. The cabin looked bare and skeletal, stripped of everything that was not essential, and still it was not warm. The cold came through the walls, through the floor, through the roof. It was inescapable. One night in late February, as Ruth lay on the floor beside the children, wrapped in her coat with her arms around James to keep him warm, she heard something that made her go still. Footsteps, outside, crunching through the snow. She sat up slowly, her heart pounding. It was late, past midnight. No one came to the cabin at night, no one came at all. The footsteps stopped outside the door. There was a pause, long and heavy. Then a knock, 3 slow, deliberate strikes against the wood. Mrs. Hawkins. The voice was muffled but recognizable. Brennan. I know you're in there. Open the door. She did not move, did not speak. The children stirred but did not wake. I came to check on you, he continued. His voice was calm, friendly even, as if this were a normal visit, as if it were not the middle of the night in the middle of winter. I heard you've been working, taking washing, mending. That's good. Shows initiative. But it's not enough, is it? Not nearly enough. She stayed silent. Her hands were clenched into fists. You're going to run out, Mrs. Hawkins. Food, firewood, time. You can't work fast enough to keep up. And when you run out... He paused. Well, my offer still stands. Better terms than you'd get anywhere else. All you have to do is be reasonable. She could hear him breathing on the other side of the door, waiting, listening. I'll come back tomorrow, he said finally, in daylight, when you've had time to think about it, when you've realized that pride is a luxury you can't afford. The footsteps moved away. She heard them recede into the distance, crunching through the snow, fading until there was nothing but silence and wind. Ruth sat there in the dark, shaking, not from cold, though she was cold, not from fear, though fear was there too, but from rage, pure, clean, burning rage. He thought he could wait her out, thought that hunger and cold and desperation would do his work for him, thought that she would eventually break, come crawling back, accept his terms because she had no other choice. He was wrong. She lay back down and pulled James close and made herself a promise. She would not go back to Brennan. She would not accept his help, his credit, his arrangement. She would work until her hands bled and her body gave out. She would burn every stick of wood in the cabin, every piece of furniture, the walls themselves if necessary. She would eat bark and snow and whatever else could be swallowed. She would beg on the street corner in Crookston if it came to that. She would steal if she had to. But she would not let him win, because this was not really about survival anymore. It was about something deeper. It was about proving that women like her, women with nothing, women the world had written off as powerless, could still say no, could still choose, could still fight, even if the fight was hopeless, even if the odds were impossible, even if no one would ever know she had fought at all. The winter was not over. The cold would get worse before it got better. The hunger would sharpen. The exhaustion would deepen. But Ruth had made her choice. She had drawn her line, and she would hold it no matter what it cost. Some things, she had learned, were not for sale. Not her body, not her dignity, not her soul. And if the price of keeping those things was suffering, then she would suffer. If it was pain, she would endure pain. If it was dying with nothing, then she would die with nothing. But she would die on her own terms. And that was worth more than any amount of credit, any promise of warmth, any offer of help that came wrapped in shame. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind and the sound of her children breathing, and somewhere in that darkness she found a kind of peace. Not happiness, not hope exactly, but clarity. The cold, hard clarity of knowing who she was and what she would not become. And that would have to be enough. The snow that had fallen the night of Brennan's visit did not stop for 3 days. It came down in waves, thick and relentless, piling against the cabin walls until the drifts reached halfway up the door. Ruth had to dig her way out each morning, just to reach the small pile of scrap wood she had been scavenging from the property, broken fence posts and rotted boards pulled from the old shed that was collapsing at the edge of the clearing. The wood was poor quality, damp and half-decayed, and it smoked terribly when it burned, filling the cabin with acrid gray clouds that made the children cough. But it burned, and burning meant not freezing. She worked through those 3 days in a kind of trance, moving from task to task without thinking, without feeling. She walked to the farms when the snow let up enough to see more than a few feet ahead. She took whatever work was offered. She carried wet laundry through knee-deep drifts. She hauled firewood for a farmer's wife who paid her in potatoes, 4 small ones, wrinkled and sprouting, but still edible. She scraped manure from a barn floor for a man who gave her 15 cents and looked at her like she was something pitiable and vaguely disgusting. She did not care. Pity could not hurt her. Disgust could not touch her. She had gone past the point where shame had power. All that mattered was the work, the coins, the small amounts of food she could trade or buy, the fuel she could burn to keep the cabin above freezing for 1 more day. The children were quieter now. They had stopped asking when things would get better. Mary helped without being asked, watching James while Ruth was gone, trying to keep Samuel warm, rationing the tiny amounts of food Ruth brought home. She was 6 years old and already learning that survival meant silence, meant not complaining, meant making yourself small and undemanding. Ruth hated that, hated what this winter was teaching her daughter, but she could not change it. She could only keep moving forward. It was on the 4th day after the snow had finally stopped that Ruth noticed the package. She had come home late, exhausted from a day of washing clothes in water so cold it made her hands go numb within minutes. The sun was setting, the sky turning that particular shade of purple-gray that came just before full dark. She pushed open the cabin door and nearly tripped over something on the threshold. A bundle, wrapped in burlap and tied with twine. She looked around. The clearing was empty. No footprints in the fresh snow except her own. No smoke from neighboring cabins, because there were no neighboring cabins close enough to see. Whoever had left this had come and gone without wanting to be seen. Ruth picked up the bundle and brought it inside. The children watched as she untied the twine and peeled back the burlap. Inside was a loaf of bread. Not fresh but not stale either. Dark rye bread, dense and heavy. Beneath it, wrapped in cloth, were 4 eggs, and at the bottom a small cloth bag that clinked when she moved it. She opened it and found kindling. Dry kindling. Small sticks that would catch fire easily and burn hot. There was no note, no name, no explanation. Mary looked up at her with wide eyes. "Who brought it, Mama?" Ruth shook her head. She did not know, but she knew it had not been Brennan. This was not his style. He wanted credit for his generosity. wanted her to know exactly who she was indebted to. This was something else, something quiet, almost anonymous. They ate the bread that night, and Ruth boiled 2 of the eggs, giving the children half each and eating nothing herself because there was not enough. The kindling she saved, rationing it carefully, using just enough each morning to get the fire started so she did not waste precious matches. 3 days later, another package appeared. This time Ruth saw it as soon as she opened the door in the morning. Same burlap wrapping, same anonymous delivery. Inside was a turnip, large and firm, and a small jar of lard, and more kindling. Ruth stood in the doorway holding the package and looked out across the snow-covered prairie. The nearest homestead was a 1/4 mile to the west, a small sod house barely visible as a dark bump against the white landscape. She had never been there, had never met whoever lived there, had assumed, like she assumed about most of her neighbors, that they wanted nothing to do with her. But someone was helping her, someone was leaving food. Not much, not enough to solve the problem, but enough to make a difference, enough to stretch their supplies a few more days, enough to keep them from the very edge of starvation. The packages kept coming, not every day, not on any predictable schedule, but regularly enough that Ruth began to rely on them, began to factor them into her calculations of how long they could survive. A potato, a handful of dried beans, a piece of salt pork. Once, a small woolen blanket, old and patched but clean and warm. Each time, the same burlap wrapping, the same silence, the same absence of demands or expectations. Ruth tried to catch whoever was doing it. She stayed awake one night, watching the door, determined to thank them. But she fell asleep sometime after midnight, exhausted beyond the ability to keep her eyes open, and woke at dawn to find another package on the threshold. She tried leaving the cabin earlier in the morning before the sun was up, thinking she might see someone approaching. But the clearing was always empty. It was like being helped by a ghost. In early March, during a brief thaw that turned the snow to slush and made walking treacherous, Ruth decided to find out who her benefactor was. She bundled the children against the wet cold and walked to the sod house she had seen from her cabin. It sat low and dark against the earth, more hole than house, with a roof of layered sod and a door made from rough-cut planks. Smoke rose from a chimney pipe that stuck up through the roof at an angle. She knocked. There was a long pause. Then the door opened a crack and a face peered out. A woman's face, old and weathered, with eyes like chips of gray stone and hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked at Ruth without speaking, her expression unreadable. "I'm Ruth Hawkins," Ruth said. "From the cabin to the east. I wanted to thank whoever has been leaving food, if it was you." The woman stared at her for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider. "Ingrid," she said. Her voice was rough, as if she did not use it often. "Come in." The interior of the sod house was dim and smelled of earth and smoke. A single room, like Ruth's cabin, but smaller, more cramped. A narrow bed in one corner, a table, a stove, shelves lined with jars and tins. Everything was neat, orderly, spare. The home of someone who lived alone and had learned to waste nothing. Ingrid gestured to a chair. Ruth sat, the children clustered around her legs, uncertain. Ingrid poured water from a kettle into 2 tin cups and handed one to Ruth without asking if she wanted it. They sat in silence for a moment. Ruth sipped the water, which was hot and tasted faintly of metal. Ingrid watched her with those gray stone eyes, her face revealing nothing. "It was you," Ruth said finally. "The packages, the food." Ingrid nodded once. She did not smile, did not soften, just nodded. "Why?" Ruth asked. "You don't know me. We've never spoken." Ingrid was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "I was a widow once," she said. "Long time ago, before this country was even a state. My husband died first winter, froze to death checking the livestock in a blizzard. I had 2 children then, a boy and a girl." She paused, looking down at her cup. "The boy died that same winter, pneumonia. The girl lasted until spring. Hunger, mostly. She just got weaker, and then she was gone. Ruth felt her throat tighten. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Ingrid shrugged. "It was 30 years ago, but you don't forget." She looked up, meeting Ruth's eyes. "I see you walking, every day, going to the farms, working. I see you come back at night, barely standing, and I see those children, and I think—" She trailed off, then shook her head. "I can't give much. I don't have much. But I can give something. So I do." "Thank you," Ruth said. The words felt inadequate, too small for what this woman had done. "It's kept us alive." "Don't thank me," Ingrid said sharply. "I'm not doing it for thanks. I'm doing it because no one helped me. And I swore, if I ever saw another woman in the same place, I wouldn't walk past, wouldn't pretend I didn't see." She paused. "The church didn't help you. The town didn't help you. That's how it is for women like us. Foreign, alone, not enough money to matter, not enough family to make us worth protecting. So we help each other. That's all there is." Ruth nodded. She understood. This was not charity. This was not pity. This was something harder and more honest. Recognition, solidarity, the acknowledgement that some women fell through the cracks of the world, and the only people who would catch them were other women who had fallen before. "Brennan came to my cabin," Ruth said after a moment, "at night. He offered help. But not the kind I could accept." Ingrid's face hardened. "Brennan," she said, and the name sounded like a curse. "He tried that with me too, years ago, before I was too old to interest him." She spat into the stove. "Men like him, they see a woman alone and think she's available, think desperation makes her willing. Some women say yes. I don't judge them for it. But I didn't, and I lived anyway." "So did I," Ruth said quietly. Ingrid looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Good," she said. "Don't go back to him, no matter how bad it gets. You go back to him, you'll never get free. He'll own you. Not just your body, your whole life. I've seen it happen." They sat in silence again. The children had settled on the floor near the stove, warming themselves. Mary was holding James, keeping him still and quiet. Samuel leaned against Ruth's leg, his eyes half closed with exhaustion. "I'll keep leaving packages," Ingrid said finally. "When I can. It won't be much, but it'll be something." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Ingrid interrupted. "I'm doing it anyway." She stood, signaling that the conversation was over. "Winter's almost done. Another month, maybe 6 weeks. You've made it this far. You'll make it the rest." Ruth stood as well, gathering the children. "How do you know?" she asked. Ingrid looked at her with those hard gray eyes. "Because you're still standing," she said simply. "That's how I know." Ruth walked home through the slush with the children trailing behind her, and for the first time in months she felt something other than exhaustion and fear. Not hope exactly, not joy, but something quieter and more durable. The knowledge that she was not completely alone, that somewhere in this cold, indifferent world, there was at least one other person who understood what it meant to survive, not because you were strong, but because you refused to quit. The packages continued. Sometimes it was food. Sometimes it was firewood. Once it was a pair of boots, old and worn but still intact, that fit Mary almost perfectly. Ruth never asked for anything. Ingrid never offered explanations. They saw each other occasionally, passing on the road, and exchanged brief nods. Nothing more. But it was enough. And slowly, degree by degree, the cold began to loosen its grip. The days grew longer. The sun climbed higher. The snow started to melt, revealing the brown, dead grass beneath. March bled into April. The wind lost its teeth. And Ruth began to believe, carefully and cautiously, that they might actually survive. Not because of charity, not because of the kindness of the community, but because one woman had seen another woman drowning and had reached out a hand, silent, unsentimental, necessary. And sometimes, Ruth thought, that was all it took. One hand, one gesture, one person willing to help without demanding anything in return. It was not much, but it was everything. The thaw came slowly, then all at once. By mid-April, the snow had retreated to gray patches in the shadows. stubborn remnants clinging to the north sides of buildings and beneath the eaves where sunlight could not reach. The earth began to soften, turning from frozen stone to cold mud that sucked at Ruth's shoes when she walked. The creek, frozen solid since December, cracked and groaned and finally broke free, water rushing over stones with a sound that seemed impossibly loud after months of silence. The air smelled different. Not warm yet, but no longer carrying that knife edge of winter, that sharpness that cut into the lungs with every breath. It smelled of mud and wet grass, and something green trying to push its way up through the dead layers of last year's growth. Ruth stood outside the cabin one morning in late April and felt the sun on her face, weak but real, and realized for the first time that they had made it. They had survived. The winter that had tried to break them, that had taken almost everything they had finally released its grip. They were still standing, but standing came with a cost. She looked down at her hands, holding them up in the early light. They were scarred and calloused, the skin cracked and rough, the nails broken and dark with dirt she could not quite scrub away. There were burns from the stove, cuts from splitting wood, places where the cold had damaged the skin so badly it would never fully heal. These were not the hands she had brought into winter. These were the hands of someone who had fought for every day, every meal, every breath of warm air. They were ugly hands, laborers' hands, but they were hers. The children emerged from the cabin, blinking in the sunlight like creatures unused to brightness. They were thin. Mary's dress hung on her like a sack, her arms stick-thin, her face all angles and shadows. Samuel moved slowly, still weak from the illness that had nearly killed him in February. James, who had turned 2 sometime during the winter, though Ruth had lost track of the exact date, was small for his age, undersized, and quiet in a way that worried her. They had survived, but survival had marked them, changed them. They would carry this winter in their bodies for the rest of their lives, but they were alive, all 3 of them, intact, whole, and that was more than many families could say. Ruth had heard the news in town, bits and pieces gathered during her infrequent trips to buy supplies. The Olsen family, 2 homesteads north, had lost a child in January. Diphtheria. The Andersons had abandoned their claim in March, packed what they could carry, and left in the middle of the night, heading back east to family they should have stayed with in the first place. The Jorgensens had made it through, but barely, and the wife had lost 3 fingers to frostbite. Stories like that were common. Winter in Minnesota was a test, and not everyone passed it. Ruth had passed, not with grace, not easily, but she had passed. She began to rebuild. The cabin was nearly empty, stripped of everything that could burn, but she did not mind. Furniture could be replaced. She scavenged wood from the collapsed shed and built a new table, rough and uneven but functional. She traded work for a bed frame, assembling it piece by piece in the evenings after the children were asleep. She planted a garden, digging into the cold mud with her damaged hands, placing seeds in careful rows. Potatoes, beans, turnips, carrots, things that would grow in poor soil and harsh conditions, things that would keep them fed when the next winter came, because there would be a next winter, and the one after that, and the one after that. This was her life now, this land, this cabin, this struggle. She had no illusions about it becoming easier, but she knew now that she could endure it. That knowledge was worth something. She found more work as spring progressed. Farmers needed help with planting, with mending fences, with 100 small tasks that multiplied as the growing season began. She took it all. The pay was poor, but it was steady, and by the end of April she had saved enough to buy flour and beans and lard, enough to fill the shelves again, to look at the stores of food and not feel the constant gnawing anxiety of scarcity. Ingrid still left packages occasionally, though less often now that the worst was past. Ruth saw her once in early May, working in her own small garden plot. They exchanged nods. No words, no need for words. The debt between them was not one that could be repaid or measured. It simply existed, a silent understanding that bound them in ways the community never had and never would. One afternoon in mid-May, Ruth went to town to buy seed. She entered Brennan's store because it was the only place that sold what she needed, and she would not let him keep her away. He was there behind the counter, exactly as he had been in December, exactly as he probably always would be. Soft hands, careful hair, eyes that calculated value. He looked up when she entered, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or annoyance that she had not broken, had not come crawling back the way he had predicted. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I wasn't sure I'd see you again." "I need seed," she said flatly. "Turnips and beans, 2 pounds of each." He measured it out in silence, pouring the seeds into paper packets, tying them with string. She counted out the money, placing the coins on the counter one at a time. Exact change. No credit needed. No debt owed. He took the money and handed her the packets. For a moment their eyes met, and Ruth saw something in his expression that might have been respect, but looked more like resentment. She had refused his terms. She had survived anyway. And that refusal, that survival, was a kind of victory he could not erase. She turned and walked out without another word. Outside, the sun was warm on her shoulders. The street was busy with people preparing for the growing season, farmers and their wives moving between shops, children running and shouting, the whole town alive with the energy of spring. Ruth stood for a moment watching them. These people who had turned away when she needed help, who had judged her and found her wanting, who had expected her to fail. She had not failed. She had not bent. She had not broken. She had not sold herself or her dignity, or any part of what made her who she was. She had simply endured. She had worked until her hands bled. She had made choices that hurt. She had accepted help from the one person willing to give it without conditions, and she had come through the other side changed but undefeated. Some victories were loud. They came with celebration and recognition and reward. But this victory was quiet, private, the kind of victory no one would ever write about or remember, but it was real, and it was hers. She walked home with the seed packets in her pocket and her children waiting at the cabin, and she felt something she had not felt in months. Not happiness exactly, not hope in the bright, easy sense, but something deeper. A kind of hard-won peace, the knowledge that she had been tested in ways she never expected and had discovered reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. The winter had tried to break her. It had taken almost everything. Her health, her comfort, her illusions about the kindness of the world. But it had not taken her children, and it had not taken the part of herself she valued most, her ability to choose. Her refusal to be reduced to something less than human by desperation. That night, after the children were asleep, Ruth sat outside the cabin and watched the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The air was cool, but not cold. The wind was gentle. Somewhere in the distance a bird called, its voice clear and piercing. Spring, life, renewal, all the things she had not been sure she would live to see. She thought about the woman she had been in November, standing by Thomas's grave, frightened and alone and uncertain. That woman felt like someone from another life, softer, more fragile, less certain of what she could endure. The woman sitting here now was different, harder, scarred, but also stronger, more sure of herself, more willing to stand alone if standing alone was what survival required. She had learned things this winter, terrible things, that the world was not fair, that goodness was not rewarded, that asking for help often meant being turned away, and that sometimes the only person you could rely on was yourself. But she had also learned that strength came in unexpected forms, that solidarity existed even in the loneliest places, that saying no, even when saying yes seemed easier, was its own kind of power. And she had learned that freedom, real freedom, the kind that let you look at yourself in the mirror and recognize the person staring back, always had a cost. Sometimes that cost was hunger. Sometimes it was cold. Sometimes it was standing alone against a world that wanted you to disappear. but it was a cost worth paying. She stood up and went inside. Tomorrow she would plant the garden. She would continue working. She would prepare for the next winter, because the next winter would come whether she was ready or not. But she would face it as herself, whole, unbroken, free. And that was worth more than any amount of credit, any promise of warmth, any offer of help that came wrapped in chains. The cabin was dark and quiet. The children slept soundly, their breathing steady and peaceful. Ruth lay down on her cot and pulled the thin blanket over herself, and for the first time in months, she fell asleep without fear. The winter was over. She had survived. And sometimes, in a world that expected women like her to fail, survival itself was the greatest victory of all. Have you ever chosen something difficult because the easy path would have cost you something you weren't willing to lose? Have you ever stood alone when the world expected you to bend? Share your story in the comments. I read every single one.